All right, and we are back finally with hopefully a more successful series of genre reviews. I know you people wanted me to cover the other one, Necropolitics, but for some reason not very well received. I guess, I don't know, maybe you bit off more than you can chew. But anyways, I wanted to cover this more in depth, this particular book. And maybe, I know people that know John David Ebert, so maybe he'd come on the show. I love that. I believe it was, like, I don't know, was an episode, it was like a middle episode of Caribbean Rhythms, where Bap was like, maybe I discuss it in episode 45 of show, you know? I don't know, it's just little funny vocal tics I have. I don't know, when I was a kid, I would think of a phrase, or I would think of something that I thought was funny, and I would say it over and over and over again. Maybe I have some kind of neurodivergency. But anyways, this is the first installment. I believe I'm only going to get to, because this is a book I really must read almost word by word. The first installment, I'll probably only get to the introductory chapter of John David Ebert's Art After Metaphysics. A book that I, keep coming back to. A book that I discovered many years ago. All right? I remember, I think it was like, this must have been before, this must have been like before a lot of different exposure to different more esoteric content in the E-Right. This was, I don't know, it must have been when it first came out in 2013. I think I discovered it on a recommendation by Amazon because I think I may have bought Yuga at the time by Marty Glass. Another book that I might cover in the future. But this book, ever since picking it up, and 2013 was also when I started to get more serious about being an artist, really did transform my way of thinking. And it's a book that I constantly go back to. And hopefully that it's a book that you will find interesting as well, because a lot of what's written here is certainly the foundation of a lot of my thinking around the work of art. But I'm sure there's like parts of, disagreements and so forth. But we'll get into that. And the introductory chapter does have his sort of outline of the purpose of the book and why it's important to look at these, modern or contemporary artists, and why it is that these things matter, and why that the later half of the 20th century, even before that, really, I would say the last 100 years, has unleashed a sort of psychic cataclysm, a sort of collective unconscious collapse into the sort of thinking and artistic and cultural and even spiritual space that most people have in their lives. And why is it important to sort of, and as he will say, the artist's job nowadays is to sort of like shift through the ashes of the wake. Again, another phrase I keep going back to because, of the Lamb of God album, Ashes of the Wake. So, why it's important for the artist to keep coming back to it, and why the artist is like tasked with the job of creating their own world. And I know like people would disagree with that. A lot of trads. I don't know. I think I had this exchange with Paul Talk once about how, about John David Ebert. He's like, oh, I hated it. This is just Heideggerian. This is like, there's no like trans-historical truth. But I guess John David Ebert's point is that the truth with a capital T that artists have to rely on throughout the centuries, that has been thrown into question, like everything else in life. And the work of art is sort of a barometer more than anything to look at why this questioning, this interrogation, as Heidegger comes back to over and over again, the interrogation of itself, the work of art, why it's necessary to look at it, because ultimately art becomes a prism or a window into the collective psyche of a particular civilization. Which is very, a very cliched point, but it's the truth. It's something that you really can explain it at its heart. I mean, you can explain it, through certain spiritual terms. I know Jung, and maybe I'll read a little bit of Jung. I'm even looking at it right now as I speak. The Spirit of Man, Art, and Literature, part of his collective writings, which I own. I own all of Jung's collective writings, except for his Nietzsche seminars. I only have the abridged version, because I actually was going to drop $200 to buy Jung's full complete lecture on Nietzsche. But Amazon screwed me again at the last moment. This was years ago. I wonder if it's still there. But, to quote the Iron Sheik, Hulk Hogan screwed me again. Really, Amazon screws me again. But anyways, so I think we'll get into this, and I really feel that this will be a good series, and hopefully you people will follow along. Hopefully you'll spread the word. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Share with your friends, and hopefully we'll get more traction than necropolitics. But I did feel that necropolitics was important enough to cover, but if, you people, I guess you lost interest as soon as you, I know why. I don't have to say it. I mean, for the YouTube portion, I'm not going to say it, but, I can guess. I can hazard to guess as to why, you people dropped out, in the later half when Mbembe talks about, Franz Fanon and all that. But anyways, let's get into it. As I've said, like, share, and subscribe. Go, the full version will be available on, Patreon and Substack. I like how Substack, every time you upload something, you do get new followers at random. That's pretty good. But anyways, this is the introduction, but a few words about the cover. Of course, as you can see, the cover photo is integral as well. It's a, I believe it's a piece of welded art with various, mixed media, various mixed media applications and so forth. For this book's color illustration, I've chosen the work by contemporary British artist Chris Boyd, entitled The Book of Daresibu, that's how you say it. It is a strange and enigmatic book in which Boyd says was inspired by his witnessing of the volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, where he spent a good deal of his childhood growing up. Cebu is located there. The book has a central gaping hole that appears to be cracking with lavic energies that might erupt at any moment. It is perfect metaphor for Zygmunt Bauman's liquid modernity. So even back then he was thinking about this. Of course, I have his other book, but I believe he fell out, John Dave Ebert, with his co-writer about liquid modernity. They were going to make a follow-up book, but, well, we'll see. The age in which we now find ourselves living, in which all the cultural forms, or what the Cornelius Constratus called imaginary significations, are melting down into a kind of slag heap of broken models, discarded signifiers, and retrofitted artifacts that might characterize the denizen of the Mad Max landscape, who constructs his own world out of the debris of previous civilizations, like a bricolaire. A bricolaire, someone that collects knickknacks, a garbage man, a junkyard man, essentially, a junk man. But it's funny that, liquid modernity, like the slag heap is a good example, like it's a good metaphor. Because when you do melt down metal, all those impurities come out into slag, and you skim it off from the top, and the sort of the molten liquid metal, the basic process. But it essentially comes after a process of liquidation. So, but what struck me about the images is the evocation of the great medieval book as work of art from the time of Charlemagne's court library at Aix-la-Chapelle, when huge manuscripts were transformed into 12-pound books with ivory plaques on their covers. These books were made by the monks at Charlemagne's court, some of which were survivors of various Viking raids of the Irish monasteries, Alcuin was one such individual, for instance, who carried with them to Charlemagne's court the knowledge of making of illuminated manuscripts. Yeah, illumination was in itself an integral art form. It had combined so many different things. In a sense, even literati painting in China has some similar significance in that it combines various art mediums. It combines calligraphy, it combines illustration, and it combines the written word, poetics, and writing, and so forth. And illumination of manuscripts became significant, but it transforms our relationship to artwork in a way, in that it serves a higher spiritual purpose while also serving a decorative purpose in terms of decorations of various important documents and so forth. So when you think of it, the book becomes a form of art, but it's something that is personalized, something that is smaller. It's not that easily accessible compared to a gallery. Archivalists have this problem of displaying them, right? Because they're meant to be read. They're not meant to be displayed the way that, a painting is. So you have this transformation of the work of art, and I think it's kind of interesting how the metaphor, and of course John David Ebert, JDE, as I'll for abbreviation, I'll call him JDE, right? Or just Ebert. This book now becomes burnt out. It becomes blown of all significance. It's a hole. It's like a welding mark. It's like, a crater. Now the book, the word, remember this. In the beginning there was the word, right? That is why, at least in Catholicism, manuscripts were illuminated, because it was the word that carried with it its significance, its divine logos, right? Logos means many different things. But the relation between word, between voice, God speaks the world into existence, that also implies language. Language implies the evolution of consciousness, as McLuhan would say, right? As language becomes more advanced and more easily accessible, now we enter into a relationship to the linguistification of being, right? This is very much like a Latour point of like, well, postmodernism is always with us. Because with a written language and with movable type, it's like now we have a further like liquidation of thought and mythopoetic time into language, right? So those oral traditions like go by the wayside. It's very much like a Latourian point of like, we were never modern, we were never postmodern. They all imply each other, right? But it's significant because this is a contemporary artist saying that the word has now been transformed into its absence, into nothingness. The ultimate iconoclasm of a book being empty. Because now the divine word, the divine book, has been blown out, right? But that's an artistic representation of that. Because illumination in the medieval manuscripts was of significance. Because even though it was artwork that wasn't artwork, they didn't have this aestheticized consciousness. It very much was for a higher purpose. Even if very few people, only monks, other monks would see this, it still carried the weight and the significance of it. I long contemplated about doing a zine. I'll probably do one this year. I'm currently trying to write a book, but that's like more of an academic text because, again, being inspired by art after metaphysics, I definitely want to write a book like this. John David Ebert, for all of his flaws and all of that, I mean, he's only human. He's a huge inspiration to me, as an outsider thinker. And I've learned immensely from him. And John David Ebert, if you're listening to this, I really wanted to cover this because this book has basically changed my life. And for that, I will always be eternally grateful. I will always be John David Ebert's, his fattest soldier. So, moving on. Aix-la-Chapelle, which Spangler once compared brilliantly to a sort of Manichaean fortress stronghold like Pylos, which borrowed its cultural forms from the southern and more cosmopolitan civilization of Minoan Crete, just as Charlemagne's palace borrowed cultural forms, such as the candy striping and the architecture, from the more cosmopolitan civilization of the Spanish Islamic Moors of Cordoba, was then a sort of cultural refuge that gathered together the knowledge of the time and began the painful and intricate process of reconstructing Western civilization, right? So immediately, John David Ebert says that we live in a time similar to Charlemagne's. And then now you have to sort of sort out and pick up what is the constitution of what we know as quote-unquote Western civilization, or European civilization, which is probably a better term, right? Because Western civilization's like this amorphous term. You know, is Japan Western civilization? Maybe, right? So, European civilization. So, in a way, the reason John David Ebert picks this image in the book is because it's saying the same thing. Like the Book of Kells, like other illuminated manuscripts, our illuminated manuscript is an absence, right? It's a blown out lava husk. It's been welded, it's industrial, but now it's post-industrial. Notice that, the image. It's post-industrial in that it once represented sort of a form of industry, but now it's sort of like the abandoned ruins of industry that you find in every urban exploration video. You find like various weld moldings on different industrial machinery, that it's rusted out. You name it. Like, this is what it evokes, right? So, yeah, anyways. The cover of these books as artworks unto themselves were often ivory-carved images replete with Christian iconotypes, such as the crucifixion or the Assumption of Mary to heaven, or to one another of the four evangelists, which served as a common iconography of the time, the Gospel Book of Charlemagne, or the Epreni Gospel, or the Book of Periscopes, dates from about this time, and the iconotypes lovingly carved into their covers served as the basic structural forms of the entire age. They were transcendental signifieds that anchored all meaning in a concrete system of references that prevented truth from sliding around into semiotic chaos. But today, all transcendental signifiers are gone. But the signifiers of contemporary art all refer back to a series of semiotic vacancies, like scars on the walls of being, that once used to organize the Western mind, but which do so no longer. Boyd's Book of Dudasibu, with its central rupture where once upon a time there used to be such grand significance as the apocalypse or the crucifixion, now features only a semiotic vacancy at the ontological center of Western being. Being has been gutted. Its transcendental signifieds have all melted down. It now exists in a magnetic flow of lava, forms that are failing to crystallize into any perceivable shape. Right? Abstraction. Hello? People think that, like, it's a con or something, right? But really, as we'll see, as we see in the book here, as soon as we get to Jackson Pollock, which will come up, I believe, next week, we'll see that it was no accident, right? Not the accident, there was, like, a conscious intent of, like, oh my god, we're scamming people of money. Maybe later on, of course, but originally, it was merely responding to something very deep within the Western psyche that Jackson Pollock tapped into, which we'll see. Boyd's Book of he says, it is an intimidating task. So the West discarded pile of signifiers is an intimidating task, but we currently have men and women on the job working to fashion new signifiers for the dawning age of uncertainty and anxiety that is now looming over the horizon upon us. The volcanic reference on Boyd's book cover furthermore suggests the possibility of imminent catastrophe that our age now finds itself currently under, just as the Vikings of Charlemagne's time constituted a looming threat. A sort of permanent state of emergency in which floods, famines, fires, tsunamis, and explosions, or health events, have surrounded us on all sides. What catastrophe will take place next, and what will happen? My backyard or yours? So it's significant because the beginning of the book really cements the sort of need to study what's going on in the art world. because that still is, a vital source of what will happen in general. He wrote this in 2013. Think of how much the world has changed since this book was written. Now, I want you to think of that as we're going along and reviewing this book, but also think about some of the things he got right. Think about some of the motifs here, right? Think about some of the things that the issues these various artists brought up. Think of from 2013 till 2023 in the world we're living in right now. So there you go. Moving on. So the introductory chapter is called The Four Ages of European Art. So right off the bat, we have art then after metaphysics. The metaphysical age was an invention of Heidegger's that spans a chasm of Europe's intellectual history from Plato to Nietzsche, in which all of the West's grand metaphysical narratives were constructed, but which, from about the time of Nietzsche's enunciation of the death of God, began to collapse and disintegrate like Valhalla at the end of Wagner's opera Götterdämmerung. I believe I pronounced that right. I'm probably not. Heidegger saw himself as a sort of epilogue or appendix to this grand age of metaphysical certainties, for which the replacement of being by technological enframing, all that he saw remains as the task of thinking for contemporary philosophers, was varying degrees of aletheia-type truth-making, in which entities brought into the clearing are from henceforth like the blurred photographs on the canvas of Gerhard Richter, that is to say, lacking the pristine clarity of absolute truth. Such entities could only hope to attain to one another degree of truth. So into the clearing of being, of revealing. Remember Heidegger, truth is aletheia, which means revealing, also a clearing into itself. Aletheia being that truth is something that has sort of a double element of revealing, but also concealment, or being and non-being, or potentiality and actuality, right? So truth is this very slippery thing. And every age now has this truth. No longer is there this universal capital T truth, but rather every age inhabits their own space for a particular truth, right? So this is what Heidegger is saying. This is the collapse into the post-metaphysical age, where metaphysics is still there in a sense, but it's much more difficult to pin down now that there is this thing that happened, from the 19th to the 20th century, where the sort of signifiers of all of Western civilization collapsed in itself, and now people no longer have the same headspace that they once did when it came to belief, when it came to the metaphysical certainty of truth. And a lot of different things contributed to this, right? Now that we live in the age of infocracy, we can finally see the machinations of living in a perspectival age. There is a sort of not a grand narrative, but rather a sort of stability to, or a semi-stability going into an entropy of the current narrative that is enforced by a sort of moralism and normalcy when it comes to, official claims to truth and what is valuable, and it all just boils down to, liberalism and materialism and all that stuff, right? But there's a sort of metastability there because of the fact that there's a metastability to it because of the fact that it develops from a series of moments in our civilization's history. Technology is certainly one of them. The sort of exacting certainty of certain professions that then the sort of the regime that we live under cordyceps and claims the legitimacy of for itself. There's many different reasons why we live in the age of uncertainty, but yet certain institutions and certain ways of living persist that are then slowly being degraded. But, the work of art reflects this sort of uncertainty is what John David Ebert is getting at. So, but again, the criticism of that approach, that Heideggerian approach, I remember, again, talking to Paul talk about this, is that, John David Ebert, he takes this Heideggerian perspective because you really can't see any way out of it. You could say that, okay, you can have this thing called, true painting or true artwork or whatever, or, going back to a metaphysical age in philosophy. But really, the logic of it is still there. You still have to deal with the fact that you live within this postmodern age. That really it seems like there's this sort of this spiritual cloud that just shadows all things that you really can't find yourself out of really quickly. So the artist really is attuned to this. So moving on. But then before the metaphysical age that Heidegger saw, beginning with Plato's divorce of being from becoming, there was a long, long stretch of myths, religions, ideas. So this is basic Heideggerianism, because Plato divorced myth from, philosophy. Contemporary philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has demarcated as pre-metaphysical age an age in which being in the world meant to be in the body of the great mother, right? The chthonic, the mother, the the longhouse mother. Hence but of course, wisdom is also womanly, right? It's also Sophia. It's coded as feminine, as it just is coded as chthonic, right? So hence the conception of the earth in the time of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians as a sort of embryo surrounded by the amniotic fluid of a vast world ocean and enclosure, right? So this is even what Trad Westerner says, Brendan Hurd, that the Greeks really took from the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians this perfection of being within art, within the work of art, within sculpture, especially sculpture, that we've been sort of getting away with it as soon as we introduced, more scientific, rationalistic concepts of perspective. Then we broke away from that concept of perspective, and now we're arrived at sort of like a semiotic chaos. But, the possibility of returning is also something very slippery. Something that is, you're never going to really rival that Greek perfection in a way. So you have to find a way to deal with it. So where can the work of art go from there, is the point. So the Egyptian sort of embryonic surrounding the amniotic fluid of a vast world ocean enclosure. That's sort of the world of myth, right? Of collective, wisdom traditions that come from oral traditions that have a very different, this is Julian Jaynes, John Gebser and Julian Jaynes, the bicameral mind, that was a oneness at one point. Jean Gebser talks about the evolution of consciousness. That this was like the world picture of a very connected people that lived through the unconscious collectively. They didn't have the sort of like a separation, an advanced rationalism, where you are a mind unto yourself. There's conscious criticism and so forth. So, at least in Egypt, by a sky goddess whose belly was full of stars, Nut, for instance, or later Hathor, the cow goddess of the daytime sky. The pre-metaphysical age has an eminental rather than transcendental understanding of being. It's within the world. The gods and goddesses are in our time. They have an investment. They exist and dwell within being and creation itself, right? It was only very, very later on, with Zoroastrianism, do we get this separation, right, between the metaphysical and the eminent. God, there's different interpretations, right? Whether Zoroastrianism bred a form of Gnosticism or proto-Gnosticism or whatever. But really, the age of monotheism or polytheism that sort of fades into the aether, that comes much later. So it very much was the gods and mythos was eminental. The spirit world was within our world and had concern over the workings of this world, right? Even in Greek myth. So, but John Dewey will go on to explain how this relates to the work of art. Pre-metaphysical age had an eminental rather than transcendental understanding of being, and correspondingly all religious journeys through the cosmos had a decidedly downward tendency from Inanna's prototypical journey to the underworld of Irkalla, to the fate of the soul in the various afterlife scenarios of the Egyptian underworlds presided over by a mummified god like Osiris. But notice that Plato, in the Myth of Ur, and then the very last book of the Republic, he sort of metaphysicalizes that relation. that now the underworld is somewhere else. And you can go through it and then come back and so forth. It's almost like it kind of is like proto-Christianity in some ways. But then according to Sloterdijk, being in the world during the metaphysical age was being in the Father. And so is precisely during this episode that the concept of the paternal womb comes into being, the paternal womb, as an attempt to appropriate the birth-giving powers of the Great Mother by a whole horde of father demiurges and progenitors. Zeus, for example, gives birth to Athenia, or God the Father gives birth to the Logos from out of the uterine depths of his own mind. So then now you have the rise of patriarchal creator gods, right? So becomes more advanced. The advancing of patriarchal norms comes about more of a higher, well-developed civilization than the Earth mothers, right? The Longhouse mothers. So, Father gives birth to the Logos of the uterine depths. His own mind. Mary is the only chosen biological vessel of this dual substantive being, for her task is now limited to creating the physical body of the already pre-existent Logos being when it comes to Mary and Christ. It is during this period of the great metaphysical age that all religious journeys from the myth of Plato's cave to the ascension or the ascensionist literature of the church fathers has an upward valiance. For the only Midland heap of underworlds left over from the previous pre-metaphysical age have lost all of their appeal and become associated with the realm of carnality and physicality. Osiris, for instance, was the god of the constructed physical body, whose Christ becomes the Lord of the spiritual body, and all must now follow into the wake of the paths broken by him through the heavens. In the post-metaphysical age, that being with Heidegger, however, being in the world now means a being thrown into the world, in which, as Sloterdijk points out, a real outside now appears for the first time. The individual finds himself thrown into the world in a sort of horizontal direction, full of angst and care, unprotected by an overarching metaphysical immune system. Hence, perhaps, the significance of Edvard Munch's 1895 painting, The Scream, right? The Scream is the sickness of the century. The Scream is the anxiety of a coming into being of a new era, much more pessimistic than a lot of other modernists, right? As we will get into when he covers the modernists, when he covers The Scream by Edvard Munch. Let me finish off this page, then I'll explain a bit more. There are neither journeys upwards nor downwards to make, for the individual must now crawl about the surface of the earth in quest to drastic solutions to the crisis of shelllessness. Artificial substitutes for transcendence now begin to appear. Drugs or sex, AI, right? For instance, which are designed to replicate the ecstasies of the ancient transcendental journeys which, once upon a time, were part of the vast fabric of the metaphysical age. And so art then in post-metaphysical age is an art that has lost touch with being. For being now denigrated into technological enframing, and consequently to great meaning systems, exist any longer for the art to realize or manifest. As Jacques Derrida pointed out in his early essay on structure, sign, and play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, there is now an absent ontological center at the heart of the West's understanding of being, which once used to be occupied by what he called or termed transcendental signifieds, basically the Kantian idea of reason, God, soul, freedom, and immortality. But this, with the death of the image of God, but with the death of the image of God as pronounced by Nietzsche, the transcendental signifieds once again function to anchor and orient all the West signifiers, as made evident, for instance, in art, have crumbled and collapsed. So the death of God brings about this collapse of the signified, right? It's now no longer are the signs in the work of art pointing to anything. They're very self-referential. They point to themselves. They talk about the materiality of the work of art, of, installation, pieces talking about the material that you use, the physicality of the paint, and so forth. You get the point. All systems of meaning and all philosophic narratives whatsoever. Philosophy, consequently, can no longer function with any kind of absolute metaphysical certainty. No, it becomes the handmaid of science, or it becomes literary theory. And art, contemporary art in particular, now suffers from a crisis of meaning. But in order to understand how the situation of contemporary art comes about, whose significance all or signifiers all refer not to being, but to a series of semiotic vacancies, we have to pause for a moment to examine the history of the West transcendental signifieds, which has changed and evolved through time. Once, long ago, the transcendental signifieds that anchored all meaning systems were composed of what I term iconotypes, which refer to the main structuring of motifs of medieval art. Motifs such as the incantation, the Assumption of Mary to heaven, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, etc. Those iconotypes form the very ontological fabric of the cosmos itself, but they underwent a series of transformations, which during the various epochs of Western art, they took on different meanings. It is important to be able to recognize the transformation of the transformed iconotypes as they reappeared in each epoch to perform different functions, but yet remained as the structural features holding together the very interior of each epoch. So let me explain a little bit. So essentially, the work of art reflects the world picture that is expressed in philosophy and mythos. So the heliocentric world is sort of high civilization. Everything, including the work of art, points upwards, right? Look at, was it the Ascension painted by Raphael? Would be like Christian cosmology, the order of the heavens, the celestial bodies, the Sistine Chapel painted, by the way, Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine Chapel alone. He had a lot of very highly skilled artists that helped him paint the Sistine Chapel. But the point being is that in the middle, you have the ascension point. You have, everything going upwards to the heaven, eventually reaching God. That was civilization. That was the sort of overarching picture that informed everything. The artwork that you find that, it's hard to say artwork because really they were objects of veneration and celebration. They had rituals attached to them. They're very practical. But the artwork that you find in the ancient world denotes that sort of mother call, right? The Venus of Willendorf. It's ground, it's pottery, it's very much pointing down to the earth, to sort of in a downward motion. It's getting at the deep, murky, chthonic roots of the Great Mother. A lot of indigenous artwork has a lot of, incantations and paradoxes and so forth. A lot of them denote the same vibe, right? So it was only until the Greeks really, the Egyptians and then the Greeks, that you start to have a formulated masculine onward and upwards mythos that informed all of society. But it's funny that in some ways postmodernism, or like this age of collapse, you could say, is very eminentized. It's very much rhizomatic. It's everywhere. There's no more grand art movements. There's no one civilizational picture that lords over the rest. Not only does it bring it down to it's horizontalized. It's like the desert of the real, right? It's a desert. It's a flat plain. It's not into the earth. It's not in the sky. Upwards. That picture, our work of art, is everywhere all at once. It's the desert. But it's in some ways a return to the earth. It's a return to the lower aspects of it. It's a return to, this is the point of the longhouse society. It's even the work of art. It's very longhouse, the contemporary art world, because we're returning back to that space of the primitive, of the chthonic, but not in a genuine sense, not the way the tribesmen felt it in antiquity, prehistory. It's not like what Jung said, that we're still living in this separated consciousness that is just, taken away from the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious still arises, but we don't live unconsciously the way that our ancestors did. So we have sort of the worst of both worlds. We sort of have the conscious criticism and rationalism of middle period high civilization. But we also have the worst element of Earth Mother, Longhouse. I know the meme term, right? The sort of collapse into chaos, into primal chaos that makes its way through the back door of civilization, terminally like reason pilling itself into its opposite, into chaos. That's what instrumental reason gives you. And the work of art reflects this. You know, the Soviet realism, surrealists, the German expressionists, you name it. That sort of intense expression of the soul-crushing alienation has now given way to a new art form. One that is totally perspectival. One that is totally digitally reproduced. Not only does it express the alienation of the other, but the alienation of ourselves. That's sort of like 20th century industrial society alienation. The sickness of the century. It's quite different now that we live in this post-industrial age. So John David Ebert in this book is trying to tell you that the work of art is produced in society because of societal, spiritual, cultural, racial, you name it, conditions that develop over time. And the world picture, the iconotypes, come from that world picture. Can you look around and see any other iconotype? Maybe there is. This is what I intend to get at in the book I'm writing on neoliberal kitsch, is that, the iconotype is still there. It's just distorted, it's inverted, it's counter-initiatory, to use a perennialist term. So, we'll get to it. Moving on. So now we move on to the age of medieval art. The history of Northern European civilization, from both the time of the Carolingian period onwards, has been marked by a series of 5 distinctly different world pictures. There have accordingly been precisely 3 crisis points whereby one world picture dissolved and disintegrated as it transformed into the succeeding one. The first of these crisis points, and also the longest, took place between the year from 1400 to 1600. Then he goes on about the Old Kingdom and the Middle Ages, the 500-minute period, the Middle Kingdom, from the New Kingdom by Second Intermittent Period, and so on during each of these crisis points. Furthermore, the structure of previous world age underwent a collapse and transformation. So this is very much like, think of all the transformative thinkers in terms of different fields of knowledge, whether it be, Toynbee or Spangler in history, but also in sciences you have Kuhn, right? Thomas Kuhn. Sorry, Kuhn? Yeah, Thomas Kuhn. And you have the sort of transformation of the prior period gives way, and it's like a radical disruption. There is a sort of slow process of evolution, even repetition, but then there's these breaking points from which, there are breaking points from which radical transformation happens. So, especially in the work of art, this is very evident. For example, a lot of people, they point to how Hellenic and Greco-Roman and earlier Hellenic statues, when they introduced Christianity into the Roman psyche, for some reason there was a degradation of artistic skill that was only recapitulated later on in the Renaissance. Now, I know pagans will go oh, there you go, that's Christianity, that's a problem, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really the sort of period that you get in between radical disruptions. Abstract expressionism was sort of like that right after the war. And I feel the new sort of art hasn't crystallized. I mean, some people think that internet art is the new frontier of exploration, but I mean, that's, some people say well, Abex had to clear the way so that, AI art can come about. That's really just, to me, that's so incredibly stupid. But anyways, not to rag on AI art too much, we'll get to it. There's something, I think it was Bap, or it may have, no, it was Morgoth. I think it was Morgoth said, honest question, what is AI art do in terms of what problem does it set out to solve, and what does it fundamentally transform? It's funny because I received this comment on one of my YouTube videos that said that, really honestly, throughout history, normies never appreciated art. They never had the education to appreciate art, and their aesthetic experience was very limited. But even now, in the time of an immense, digital categorization and access instantaneously to all of the art in the world, to every image possible, you still have this poverty of aesthetic appreciation. But now it's in its polar opposite, where it's like, because people have so much access to everything, therefore they appreciate nothing. Whereas before, like, the peasantry largely either couldn't travel, there was no photography, obviously. Even the art that they were exposed to was in a church setting. The great galleries, even, it was only like the sort of great museum and gallery was relatively recent in terms of like human history, the way that we know it. But that's another point. So, 4 world ages, and yes, I realize this is a grand meta-narrative, but sometimes they are still useful. Begin with the medieval macrosphere, which extended from about 600 AD to 1400 AD. Then comes Heidegger's Age of the World picture, which occurred or occupies the period from 1400 until about 1860. After that comes Jean Gebser's modernist integral hypersphere, which he will get into. So Heidegger and Gebser are both integral to John David Ebert's thinking around the work of art, which you can obviously see, right? I think Jung is probably the one that links the two. Of course, I think like Jung wrote, I have to dig it up. He wrote one letter to Heidegger, but I think they didn't like each other. But anyways, I think that I think there's something to be said about Jung and Heidegger. I mean, Jung, of course, is too much of an essentialist, he's too much of a metaphysician for Heidegger, I think, but there's something interesting that John David Ebert does that we'll get to when he talks about Gebser in relation to Heidegger as, like, analyzing the development of the work of art, right? So there's a lot of weird similarities between the development of consciousness that Gebser talks about, which art is in a lot of ways integral to, which is often overlooked by a lot of people that study Jean Gebser, except for like people like Ken Wilber, and then Heidegger as well in terms of his origins, the work of art, which John David Ebert will get into. But so, which extends from 1860 to 1945, and after that, the epoch of contemporary hypermodernity, termed post-history by Willem Flusar, which we see still find ourselves occupying up until the present day, which I would say is correct. Oh, but AI art is going to change that, Yeah, okay, we'll see. In the first of these world ages, then, that of the medieval macrosphere, the cosmos is actually composed out of a series of images or iconotypes which anchor meaning, encloses and protects human society within a cosmic dome, made according to Aristotle out of aether, a shining, self-illuminating substance which has the property of turning the cosmic sphere with perfect circular motion. These iconotypes were inherited by the Western language, though not, of course, exclusively from the Byzantine tradition of icon paintings, for which is the Byzantine icon tradition that all of the most famous iconotypes are from first worked within. Christ Pantocrator, which gazes down on us with his all-seeing eyes from atop the dome of the world ceiling, as the Church of Daphne near Athens, dating from about the year 1100, the image of Mary with the Christ child in her lap, which comes from Egypt and his transformation of the goddess Isis, with the child Horus, who sits over her lap. I mean, I don't exactly agree with John David Ebert here. That's kind of like too, exactly, like, it's too, you know what I mean? It's too, like, it's too perennial, it's too, like, Zeitgeisty, it's too, like, the whole, Jesus is actually Horus or whatever. I mean, John David Ebert has a very interesting relationship to religion and Christianity, but agree to disagree respectfully. Mother Mary, the Last Supper, the baptism of Christ by John, the Annunciation to Mary, and so forth. Even the Aether, you can make an argument that the sort of uncreated light in certain, one of my favorite icons was where Christ holds a baby version of Mary, right? When Mary dies, she dies in joy, waiting to see her son in heaven. And it's almost as if, like, the son holds the mother the way the mother held the son, and there is a sort of the blue, azure, uncreated light surrounding Christ and the little child, the little baby soul of Mary as she ascends to heaven. I believe it's just called the Ascension of Mary, or no, the Dormition of Mary. That's what the Orthodox people call it. The Dormition mirror, that's like one of my favorite icons of all time. I highly recommend you look into it. But really, you could see that sort of that is also the world picture. That is the sort of heliosphere that protects all life. And both Catholicism and Orthodoxy have a propensity towards this. So you have the icons, but even in the Catholic world, even in the beginning, remember the triptych of the Garden of Earthly Delights. What is outside? What is outside the box that Hieronymus Bosch paints? It's the firmament. It's the world. It's the world sphere that holds all of Eden. It holds Earth, and there's Eden above, and there's the primordial waters below, and so you have this complete world picture. That's the whole point that John David Ebert is getting at. So, although I mean, let's face it, JDE, he does play fast and loose with a lot of his historical analysis, but that's all of us. Can't blame him for that. Hans Belding points out in his book, Likeness and Presence was itself a transformation of the Roman funeral portraits composed in Lower Egypt. So yes, there probably was some aesthetic transfusion going on, not at least on a higher level. There's some kind of collective unconscious content there that informs the work of art. But when it comes to like saying this is like that and that is like this before, that's as a Catholic myself, I got to stay away from that. I mean, it's a good point in terms of just purely the work of art, in terms of the idea of iconotypes that JDE is getting, at least in part, from Jung and John Gebser. So, during the so-called iconoclastic controversy that took place in Byzantium during the year 727 to 843 AD, the aesthetic theory for this entire First World age was worked out. Whereas the iconoclasts argued that it was blasphemy to represent images of Christ in the incantation, since such an artistic act presumed to separate the inseparable dual nature of the Logos, both human and divine, into merely physical nature in the image, iconophiles argued successfully, as it turned out, that the whole point of the incantation was the eternal world was made visible in an earthly image. Thus, so the Imago Dei is very important in Christianity, right? Like that. I'm only on page 7, but this is incredible meaning right here in the first chapter. Then we'll get to the actual contemporary artists later on, in a week from now. But yeah, so I'll explain a little bit. Besides, they argue the iconic image was not substantially identical with the divine models, but only earthly mirrors of them, like reflections seen in water. The Orthodox have a theory on the icon having at least the energies, I think. Don't quote me on this. I'm no expert. I mean, you could ask someone like Jonathan Pajot. But the icon has at least, I think, the energy of the saint, right? Like the sort of, the energy of the divine, the Logos, right? It's not like a work of art. It is a work of art, but it's not meant to be an aesthetic object. It is something more. It has within it, within the image itself, it has a divinity. Not a divinity, but like, it's hard to describe. I don't want to like step on anyone's toes, but it essentially, it aids in worship. It's something more than merely a painting, right? At least in iconography, right? And different styles come about from different, a Greek icon is different than an Ethiopian one. It's different than a Russian one, blah, blah, blah. So, reflections seen in water, they were not identical to their models, but similar to them and could thus be represented, especially for the illiterate, as a means of making contact with the spiritual world as a daily reality for the masses. Thus, the aesthetic theory for the iconotype, although rejected by the West during Carolingian times, nevertheless holds for them right down the shift into the age of the world picture. They are emanations and avatars for the realm of spiritual being and so participate in a supernatural reality. Exactly. So the age of the world picture then comes later, I believe around the High Renaissance. But think of it this way. Imagine if the iconophiles, imagine if they didn't win. What would a Christian Anconism look like? Like they have in Islam? What would cathedrals look like? What would the great works of art in the West look like if that decision was made to banish the image of Christ from the work of art? Right? Imagine that. Imagine a sort of Islamized aesthetic template for the Christian West? What would that look like? You can only imagine that, right? Like, I mean, it's like one of those, it's sort of like ridiculous, like, dude weed what ifs. But it is interesting to think about the decisions that people make in terms of the interpretation of scripture, in terms of the interpretation of the way in which the image itself is a form of worship. Those decisions impact the work of art, but also impact, on a deeper level, the spiritual template of a certain civilization going forward. Because what if it was like in Islam, where you have Iconoclasm, where they had to find very unique ways, especially in the mosques, to represent the divine without using the image? I mean, yes, in Iran and elsewhere with the miniatures, there were human figures that were purposefully abstracted the way they are in China and Japan with literati painting certain figures in Chinese art. They almost look alien. They don't look like, and of course, like later on in the development of Iranian art in particular, and in other parts of the Middle East, there were like sort of more sensuous depictions, more popular, or like you could even say vulgarized, which is funny when you look at how realism is a vulgarization from that Enconist view. That realism, rather, that instead of abstraction, it is realism that is the real vulgarity, rather than something that is purposefully, quote-unquote, abstract. Of course, they didn't think of it that way, but it is kind of interesting to look at it that way. How they came up with a very nuanced and advanced geometric and numinous form of art because of the lack of the image. Because you couldn't depict Muhammad, you couldn't depict, some of his emissaries or his wives or so forth. So it's very interesting the way that developed. Of course, the Iranian miniature, they say, predates Islamic art by quite a bit, and there's certainly a lot of similarities between the Iranian miniature and certain forms of literati painting in China and Japan and elsewhere. It's very interesting. I don't know if Giorgiani is correct, though, that he says the Bodhidharma was Iranian, but, well, we'll see about that. So, the jury's out. So, anyways, moving on. I just wanted to make that point clear. I mean, that's a very interesting thought experiment. What if Christian art went in an Iconist direction? So, thus, during the age of medieval macrosphere, I was going to say medieval manosphere. Can you imagine what that looked like? The medieval macrosphere, the artist is a cosmocontractor. Cosmocontractor, that's a very hard word here. Cosmocractor, who in painting the iconotypes is imitating the divine act of bringing forth entities. Notice the Heideggerian language. Bringing forth, making clear, that is what the artist does. It is making clear presence, opening the way to being, right? To full being. Its mode for communication is vision is therefore Pentecostal, in the sense that it is the continuous echo of a single primordial event that is constantly incarnated into the present moment in the construction of each of these images. Is wokeness, current wokeness, Pentecostalism? Maybe. Who knows? That's a controversial take right there. I'm sure Moldbug or someone, it's not Calvinism, it's, wokeness is Pentecostalism. The medieval artists, furthermore, so again, the iconotypes are, again, it's very archetypal in the sense of the particularity of each piece is embodied by this higher thing that is the cosmic iconotype. So that's a very, that is more of a metaphysical approach to art theory. So the medieval artists, furthermore, in painting these iconotypes as frescoes onto the walls of churches, as it were, painting them onto the walls of the world dome, the actual cosmosphere constructed by God, that was thought to have surrounded and captured the earth within a bounded uterine structure, the cosmic womb, you could say. But it never left. So see, it's even within ultra-masculine, ultra-patriarchal manifestation, you still have the uterine earth mother is still lurking there. It's still a dome that protects the children of the earth, right? So the children of creation. Thus, Giotto, in painting the life of the Virgin on the north wall of the Arena Chapel, is actually painting the iconotypes onto the walls of this cosmic dome, just as the Paleolithic artist, in painting his various animal forms onto the walls of his cave, was actually painting them onto the world ceiling. The animal, according to Michael Rapinglunk, may actually have been constellations. In the West, though, the iconotypes, the medieval version of Derrida's transcendental signifieds, are not so much physical constellations of the night sky, as they are temporal constellations that compose the very fabric of history itself. For the iconotypes are almost all events that occurred in time as singularities: the Last Supper, the Annunciation or the Dormition of Mary, the Incantation, the Crucifixion. So now they become points in history, right? So the dome. So it's kind of like if you look at the development of these iconotypes are always with us. Even in contemporary art, you could say that certain painters will always have that world dome that is very chaotic and distorted, right? It's different in that it's empty. It's different in that there is no projection of the iconotype onto the world picture dome. There's just emptiness. At the very end, one of the last few Rothko paintings, I know you people don't want to hear this. There's a whole chapter, by the way, in Rothko on this we're going to get to. At the very end, what did he paint? He painted those black squares in that chapel in Texas. Even though he hated, he probably hated Texaners, right? I mean, let's be honest. But, he painted this, series of bluish black voids, essentially, that are very large. And it was like the total obliteration of everything. It's like, that's the final chapter, When did he die? I believe he died in 70s? Yeah. That was the end, right? And so from there, the artist has to fill that empty canvas that Rothko left off. So when you think of the world picture, think of it this way. It's like the Werner Herzog documentary, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is one of my favorite documentaries. When he talks about how painting on the surface, painting on the dome, on the ceiling of the caves, their early ancestors, the way that they discovered figuration, the way that they even discovered very primitive, very early forms of perception, perspective and perception. Of course, everything was incredibly flat. And then, of course, Clement Greenberg came, many centuries later, many centuries later, and said that, we have to go back to this flatness because that's what the art material is. So, but it was still it was painted on the dome of consciousness. It was something that was abstract and nebulous. It was something that was in the early recesses of the collective human mind that was awakened to this awareness, right? But when it comes to the heliospheric period, when it comes to the macrocosm of medieval Christian Europe, now we have a transformation of that. Now those iconotypes on the world mother dome is created from an advanced patriarchal onward and upward solar civilization that had very specific historic epochs that were represented in the spiritual makeup of the development of that history. So you have all of this development into something from nebulous, something very primordial and chthonic, to something more advanced, something that is more clear. And then, of course, you have the development from the later Renaissance to the early Renaissance to the later Renaissance. You have the development of perspective in 3D space. You have the development of chiaroscuro and shadow, light and shadow, rather than the flatness of the icon or the flatness of early Renaissance paintings, or even like the flatness of medieval Europe, right? Now you have a more embodied realism that comes about for a reason. Of course, the Greeks had a form of embodied realism, but that was, maybe in some parts later discovered. But anyways, moving on. So they function furthermore during this age to prevent the play of signification from sliding around in semiotic chaos, as has happened today. They act in a sense as immune structures, protecting and immanentizing immunizing the the Western psyche against the impacts of the real that lay out beyond the symbolic order, in those days bounded by the world dome. So it's a security system, it's a firewall, protecting against nihilism, put it that way. This is perfectly illustrated by Jean Foucat's 1460 painting of the descent of the Holy Ghost and the faithful, in which the hand of God is shown puncturing the dome of the blue sky, whereupon it sends out ripples through the fabrics of the heavens that chase away hordes of chattering demons and devils that are shown fleeing from all the directions. The world dome that encloses and protects the human being during this age, that is to say, is an epimological structure that keeps the mind anchored in the realm of meaning, in which all signifiers refer to the iconotypes as their primary transcendental signified. So again, it's like the sort of the signifiers of that art. The art is a signifier towards the meaning, which is the signified, towards the thing, right? The thing that gives meaning, which prevents the Derridian play of signification or diffidence from ever taking place. So remember, diffidence has like one little letter in it that transforms the meaning into something else, into an aware. Remember, Derrida, it's actually pretty clever diffidence, right? Because now you have an awareness of the intertextual nature of language. And as soon as you have the awareness, you can't really go back. In the sense that words can only relate to other words, and meaning can only relate intertextually to other words and other sentence structures and other syntax. On and on and on into an infinite rhizomatic web. And diffidence gives you that awareness of it, because just changing that one little structure within the word difference, right? Because what does difference imply? It also implies repetition. Like, this is the classic Deleuzian equation. So let me look up for you what diffidence really means. It's hard to describe, especially with Derrida. So diffidence to Derrida. So for Derrida, everything that exists exists diffidently. But what is diffidence? Is the condition of being according to which there is no experience of pure presence, but only chains of differential marks. Derrida coins the neologism diffidence to indicate the presence is always different from itself and differed with relation to itself. Nothing is ever fully exhaustively present. If we had a God's eye view or God's mind understanding of it, in other words, as if we could see or understand it perfectly and exhaustively, everything always, I'm reading this source from Christopher Watkins, everything always has shadow sides, more to discover. So diffidence is set up like this. So, okay, in the West, and this is something that, for example, people that study like Eastern forms of art, this is kind of relevant actually. This is what the great sinologist, the French sinologist, Francois Julian says about the difference between literati painting and Western art, especially Western Christian art. The difference being is that with the West, you have full presence of being. This is how the oil painting reigns supreme up until very recently, right? Because you can, through the medium of painting in oils or acrylic or whatever, watercolor, you can create a facsimile of the real. You can create a full presence, a full picture of being that is more or less closed. It more or less suggests what it suggests. It is giving you a full picture, up until abstraction, of course, up until even Impressionism. You have, with Impressionism, you have suggestion. But with the Renaissance high realism, right? You more or less have a very succinct illustration, a very profound illustration, but one that is closed, one that is not purposefully abstracted or purposefully vague, the way that very pale ink washes are in Chinese literati painting, that suggested an infinity of possibilities. It's more or less closed. So language works like that. So Derrida is saying, it's almost like Derrida is having like a Zen moment here with diffidence. So Derrida is saying that, like, in the West, we predicate speech over writing because speech came first, right? So Derrida doesn't reverse that order. He doesn't say that, like, writing comes first, then language. He doesn't, like, he's saying that they're integral to each other because you need a visual observation of speech, but you also need the sound, because in French it makes much more sense. Diffidence, the way that he is grammatically switching things up. So you see that like one little flaw implies something else in that word difference. So it means that you need both speech and writing. So difference cuts through between speech and writing, in a sense, right? So it means that basically difference is to demonstrate to you the possibility of language as being intertextual, as not being like what we know in the classic Western metaphysical tradition, which is warranted true belief, or the fact that writing can point to an objective thing, right? The fact that speech denotes the real. It's all about the real. It's all about full presence, in other words. There's no ambiguity. But Derrida is saying that difference gives you this ambiguity because it purposefully, it screws with the grammatology of it. It screws with the syntax to give you that sort of, almost like that Zen moment of, that Satori moment, if you will, as kind of cringe as that sounds. That Satori moment where you realize that language is intertextual because you have to look at it, you have to sound it out, you have to realize that it doesn't quite fit. It's kind of like readiness to hand with Heidegger, where when you break the tool, you realize what the tool is. It's not just like an unconscious extension of your being by using the tool. When the tool breaks, you suddenly are in the awareness of the thing. You are in what Heidegger says, the presence of the thing. So at difference, you are in presence of language. You're in presence of how it operates. It breaks you out of it. So this is what Derrida says, but before Watkins says, difference does not precede the elements of the opposite it makes possible as the mode of existence, just as in the traditional Western metaphysics, presence itself does not precede that which is present, but is rather the way in which things appear to an all-knowing consciousness. Things are not completely present to a godlike consciousness. Like, in other words, we don't have the capacity to see every little element in which language refers to itself, refers to other sentences. One singular word refers to an infinity of possibilities, right? So this is what Derrida says, quote, what we note as difference will thus be the movement of play that produces, he puts in his quotes, and not by something that is simply an activity, these differences, these effects of difference. It is language in difference, in other words. It points to the difference producing machine that is language. This does not mean that difference, which produces differences, is before them and is simple and itself unmodified in different present. Difference is a non-full, non-simple origin. It is a structural differing order of differences. This is from Speech and Phenomenon. It's also important to grasp a further nuance. For the traditional metaphysics, presence is how everything exists, whereas exists insofar as it can be immediately present to my consciousness. This is classic Western metaphysics. If it's present, it's real, it's immediate, it's got that warranted true belief I have about the nature of the real, right? So, in the same way, difference for Derrida is the condition of possibility of my experiencing anything at all. We can thus think of presence and difference as a contrast not between two things, but between two adverbs. According to traditional Western metaphysics, truth and meaning exist presently, but according to Derrida, they exist differentially. Difference is not what there is, but how everything is. So difference is not as a concept that comes before speech and writing, and time is the condition of possibility. And there exists not so much within difference, but as difference. Is their mode of existence. Their existence is one of differing and differing in relation to themselves. So difference is all about the possibility of relation between words and between, language structures and concepts, right? What is a concept, right? It should relate to something. It's a signifier that relates to a signified, but how does it relate to that signified? Well, I guess you need more language. This is what Derrida is saying. You need more language, always. It's like, how are you going to connect the two things? How are you going to connect that? How are you going to bridge that lacuna between the thing, the object in real life, my fez right here on my table? Actually, my fez is on a pile of books. But what is a fez, right? You have to, go into it. So, difference precedes all of that. Difference is the awareness of that you need constantly more language. That that language itself exists within a network. So, wow, that's quite a bit of time to explain. Just by John David Ebert using the word difference. But, so, back to the work of art, okay? How do you relate the work of art to the world picture? The iconotypes, at least in classic civilization. So he says, Derridean play of signification or difference from ever taking place. So the mind anchored in the realm of meaning, in which all signifiers refer to the iconotypes as the primary transcendental signifiers. So again, almost like language in the metaphysical tradition in the West, the certainty of the iconotype was the visual and aesthetic template of meaning for most people, right? Because that related to something else. That related to an objective hard fact about the cosmos, the iconotypes. But now you have an awareness that each image, like each word, intertextually relates to each other image that constitutes its being. To the point where you have, like the internet nowadays, an endless stream of images that always play into each other, that refer to other things, that never ends. But it was only in the awareness of that dialectic, the sort of like anti-dialectics of it, that no longer is this dialectic relationship between the image, the iconotype, and cosmic meaning in the sort of world dome, in that picture of Western metaphysics as embodied in the work of art. Now you have pure chaos. Now you have the awareness of the intertextual nature of the image, like you have the awareness of the intertextual nature of the word, of the sentence, of language. So notice how philosophy and the work of art develop together. This is very important to understand. This is what John David Ebert is trying to get at as well. So, moving on, I'm only on page 9. Oh my god. But the iconotypes, as it turns out, are not quite as stable as they appeared to be in the inhabitants of the first world age of North European civilization. For they are, in fact, constantly undergoing transformation. Right? Like, sort of the world dome in the cave paintings and the world dome in Christianity in the medieval times. Like, they go through a bunch of structural transformations. So, in some of the earliest Byzantine icon paintings, for instance, the so-called donor or patron of the painting is usually depicted as a tiny little figure in one of the corners kissing, perhaps the foot of the Virgin who towers above him. But gradually over time, the donor, who is the actual real person, grows larger and larger, slowly pushing his way into the pictures, as in the case of Jan van Eyck's Genet altarpiece of about 1432, in which the two saints represented in the bottom panels of the reverse sides are just as the same size and the same dimension as the two donors of the paintings. Wealthy burghers named Jacques Vidchat, sorry, I can't pronounce, my god, and Lisbeth Voderloot, who are depicted praying to either side of them. The donors, real individuals from the three-dimensional world in other worlds, are slowly pushing their way into the canvases, where they will eventually usurp and replace the two-dimensional icons. All icons are two-dimensional by their very nature, for they are flat and abbreviated hieroglyphs of complex processes from the real world. Purposeful abstraction. Right? So, abstraction's not a modern invention, as you know. So, but I have more to say about the donor thing. So, he also mentions Caravaggio later on, because Caravaggio so he does. I'll get to it. So, finally, in Hans Memling's Neuwenhaven diptych of 1487. So diptych is the dual paintings, right? Triptych is 3, so it's 3 panels. The composition is constructed of 2 portraits of the same size. On the left is Mary with the church child, and the right is the wealthy burgher, who has commissioned the portraits, shown in the devotional attitude towards Mary, but notably painted exactly the same size. By the end of the Quattrolo Centro, in other words, the donor and the patron is beginning to replace the portraits of the saints with the new iconotype of the Western portrait study, of which Jan van Eyck was indeed the first great master. So Jan van Eyck, of course, as you know, the Van Eyck brothers they didn't discover oil painting. There was oil painting in the East, right? But they more or less discovered and refined oil painting, and they created the Miche technique, where you use a layer of ink and tempera, then you use very transparent glazes to create the illusion of 3D, and then later this was lost, and then, of course, in our time, Ernst Fuchs, quote-unquote, rediscovered it. Of course, he didn't rediscover it. He just read up a lot about the technique, and then, used it to create his fantastical realist artwork that later became, the kitsch of visionary art. So that's a little history into the Miche technique for you. So, in Huys van Cleve's 1511 painting of the Virgin and the Christ Child, moreover, we notice yet another new iconotype, creeping in on the corner of the canvas. For in the painting, the Virgin is shown entering the Christ Child, entertaining the Christ Child, while in the lower right-hand corner, there is a plate of fruit depicting together with some silverware and half-empty glass. So now you have the still life. The still life, a kind of secular iconotype, in other words, which the Dutch masters of their 17th century will apothesize, is now making its way into the canvases. So now you have the introduction of secular art, right? Because before, the sort of the still life of fruit and food and different objects, they were to service the narrative of the genre painting. Same with the landscape. It was only until much later that the landscape took prominence, right? Because, for example, Titian was a master of the landscape, but you wouldn't realize it. You wouldn't realize the sort of landscape studies that he was doing in nature with pen and ink and, well, you know, with ink and charcoal and so forth, you know, because those were just background fillers. Those were just like to accentuate the position and the composition of the painting. It wasn't until much later that the landscape took prominence. But here you have, the donor thing is interesting because here's a little art history lesson for you. So before you had the lack of perspective, or rather, for example, the higher you were in the celestial order, right? Like, by the time you get to Mary and Christ, they were the biggest figures. They were physically represented, right? They were the central figures. But then as realism and perspective came about, then you have a lowering of that celestial order into more or less the same physical body that had perspective, you know, bodies that were closer to the foreground of the painting. They were obviously larger, bodies that were more distant, you know, like, you know, like, this is what happened. And really, when it comes to the distortions of perspective based on size, because that size of the figure represented symbolically their importance. So, for example, when children, when they draw people, they draw mom and dad like as larger than them, larger than other adults even, because they have the symbolic representation of importance in their mind. Mom and dad, or their teacher, whatever, right? Because that's an immediate representation. That's almost like a sympathetic magic. Like, I don't want to get into Picasso's, like, you know, oh, the wisdom of a child, blah, blah, blah. I spent my whole life trying to paint like children. Like, that's stupid. But there is something to it in the sense of, like, that is a more, not primitive, not advanced, you know, not like, but it was something more within the unconscious. It's something much more symbolic. The well-developed nuances of representation weren't there because the symbolic meaning within the unconscious structure of that iconotype is more important. It was only until, like, Cézanne came about that you have almost like this weird return into a distortion of representation of bodies within a space, within a three-dimensional space. You have the bathers. The bathers is like, you know, the one where it's like the guys in the front, the woman is obviously bigger, you know, even though it can't be possible that she's that big. It's because she has a symbolic meaning there. And so Cézanne almost rediscovered that symbolic meaning by purposefully breaking the rules of point and plane and representation in a three-dimensional space and perspective. By breaking those rules, he's going back to in some ways, he's returning to tradition in certain ways. So, there you go. That's a little art education for you. And let's skip right ahead, and I'll have to cut it off soon because it's almost an hour and 30. I'll have to get, so the prehistory of the visible, that will be in the paywalled version. So, the art of the High Renaissance consists in this essence of the apotheosis of the iconotype. Leonardo's Annunciation, 1475, is the greatest of all Annunciations ever painted. It cannot be improved upon, although this will not stop other artists from trying. His Last Supper of 1485 is the apotheosis of Last Suppers. No one ever improved upon it. And Tiepolo and Braccioni's Mannerist Last Suppers, yeah, are but pale shadows of comparison. Indeed, if Leonardo had finished his adoration of the Magi, it too would have been achieved at the apotheosis of the particular iconotype, for even the mere sketch, unfinished as it was, had an enormous influence upon subsequent artists. The same might be said of the unfinished Saint Jerome in the wilderness. Michelangelo, meanwhile, had already apotheosized the iconotype of David in 1504 on his frescoes on the Sistine ceiling are composed of a series of final statements on very ancient iconotypes. God animating Adam, for instance, or the expulsion from the garden, Noah in the flood, or Yahweh himself, whose Michelangelo fixed in our minds' eye for all time as the great representation of the bearded old cosmic creator. Once the iconotypes have achieved their final statement in the works of Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian, they begin through the course of the Mannerist art of the 16th century and fade out of existence. Tintoretto, the great Renaissance deconstructionist, then of course even like before with, like Mannerism, like the Mannerists and the purposeful abstraction of the figure, like there's a lot of stuff there, right? So for example, like you have El Greco in the 1500s, that El Greco is really a good example. So then he talks about the High Renaissance. Tintoretto demolished the pure geometric schema and triangular composition which Raphael, for instance, had used on Leonardo, or Leonardo to structure their great works of art. Tintoretto actually pulls Renaissance space to pieces. His Last Supper of 1594 is a chaos of squirming forms that make a mockery out of Renaissance linearity and purity of figure. So in this painting by Tintoretto, you have this radical sort of, you have a more sensuous engagement with perspective. It's on the side, it's filled with light, it's filled with very stark contrasts of light and dark in chiaroscuro. It's from the side angle of the Last Supper. It's the very manneristic figures that have dynamism, that are elongated in some ways, that are expressive, that you have angels above in white writing, filling the area with very thin glazes, with, stark white outlines, which is a technique I've done before. But of course, I learned it from Mark Tobey. And then later on, like very, very, very later on, in the 19th century, with the symbolist painters, you have like Gustave Moreau, who takes up this, this depiction of using white, very thin white lines to depict sensuous detail, right? So, so here you have an illustration, right, of this contrast between the early and middle Renaissance to later Renaissance to Mannerism, where you have this engagement with very violently painted lines, figures that have dynamism and motion, almost at this time, at the cusp of something approaching an impressionistic painting, right? I highly recommend you look it up, The Last Supper by Tintoretto. In the painting of Leonardo, before that, then you have Caravaggio. Now Caravaggio humanizes the divine. So, with Caravaggio, the transformation has been completed. For his work, the iconotypes no longer exist in an eternal dimension at all. They have been degraded and transformed to the level of common street people. Caravaggio essentially says there are no iconotypes for the ancients, and for those ancients and saints whom you revere with all as dirty and thuggish as you or I. There is nothing in the least sacred above them. They have been relegated to the status of back alley criminals and everyday street thugs. But really, I mean, you could say that there still was a picture of the divine, right? There still was something there to grasp onto. So, like, there was a little, like, light hole of it's still, like, the divine was still there. It was at the top with these little light holes. It's like you can almost see the spirit trying to come through, but it very much was a humanistic depiction. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's like a total iconoclastic, atheistic depiction of these divine themes. But, some people would argue that. But, I mean, still, given the context that he was operating in, I wouldn't go that far. That's too far. So, Pays Leonardo, furthermore, we can actually see the transformation taking place. We're able to witness the disintegration of the medieval macrosphere before our very eyes. In its Virgin of the Rocks of 1485, the world dome has already been reduced to a crumbling cavern, in which holes and chinks are beginning to appear, though the chink in the armor, though which we can catch glimpses of an infinite horizon beyond it. And indeed, this new iconotype of the infinite horizon interrupts into the background of Leonardo's paintings and comes even more and more into focus as time goes on. His Madonna of the Yarnwinder of 1501 already features a vast and archaic landscape yawning into the murky blue distant beyond the Virgin. And by this time of his Mona Lisa of 1506, the transformation is complete. The Virgin of the Rocks, associated with the world dome, is here transformed into the goddess of infinite space, beyond whose presence a horizon of three-dimensional depths comprises the whole essence of the painting. It's all three-dimensional space. Right now you have this perspective into the world picture of the three-dimensional. So, and also, you have the prominence of landscape. Now, the physical earth is now displayed more prominently. The two-dimensional Virgin, as to say, has become three-dimensional Mona Lisa. Mona, indeed, is a contradiction of Madonna, but now she is a real person. Thus, the iconotypes of the real human being has now displaced the two-dimensional sacred icons, while the infinite horizon thus becomes the basis for all subsequent landscape paintings, has once and for all pushed the bounded world ceiling, which is now in process of collapsing and taking all iconotypes down the drain along with it. Which is a very powerful statement. Even back then, we can see this. Virgin of the Rocks, by the way, I'm not a big fan of Mona Lisa, because, Mona Lisa, it's like the world painting. It's like, it belongs to the world. It's a meme. It's like the first meme in history when you really think about it, right? But Virgin of the Rocks is like one of my favorite paintings. It's absolutely incredible. The perspective, the tight space, the fact that he was using triangular space between the angelic figures, the nymphs, that the childlike angels that accompany Mary, and the way that the foliage and the rock faces, they were painted almost impressionistically. They were jagged. They denote an axis mundi, the rock formation, but she's in this like cavernous recess that still has light, and behind it is like this alcove, the sea alcove, or I guess you could say a fjord. Even like you have this other hole on the side where you have this depiction of this other cavernous rock, this like phallic symbol, if you will. Like it really does have, contrast to what John David Hebert is saying. I get what he's saying, but I do think that there still is a lot of spiritual significance to this painting. But now the natural world is a staging ground, is a little hovel hole for the divine. There's still the angel there. They're in nature. There's plants. There's the rocks. They're in this like cavernous womb-like structure that has access to the preternatural light of the alcove beyond it. And it's like truly, especially like playing with the triangular figure shape. It truly is amazing. It's incredible. And if you zoom in on it, it's almost as if like you can even achieve, if you're a good enough painter, not that you'll ever achieve this, but you can sort of like see the decisions he's making. You can start to see visible brush strokes. So that really gets me excited. Like you could actually see him painting it. I'm such a sucker for visible brushstrokes, as people know. Truly, I like that over the Mona Lisa, to tell you the truth. I know the Mona Lisa requires a lot more skill and perspective, but I think truly that, to me, that's like one of Leonardo's best paintings, in my opinion. So that's just my preference, though, But anyways, so the two-dimensional sacred icon, while the infinite horizon thus becomes the basis of all subsequent landscape paintings, once and for all pushing out the bounded world ceiling, which is now in process of collapsing and taking the iconotypes down with them. Indeed, the 16th century, this is a great century of crisis, from which the Protestant outbreak of virulent iconoclasm. The icons are wiped clean from the stage of the world picture. The Protestant churches, as depicted, for instance, the paintings of Nerf the Elder, do not feature icons but bare walls, for the icons of the 16th century have lost their status and been delegitimized and delegitimized. The whole reason they have gone down the drain is precisely because they have lost their status as ontologically convincing transcendental signifieds. But of course, the Counter-Reformation bred mannerism, like, especially Tintoretto, right? So the Counter-Reformation, the artwork that it produced, led to mannerism because it was a stark depiction of the divine. So here, John Dave Ebert's saying that as soon as you start to predicate value on the landscape, by definition, you have to create infinite space. So here in the painting of Mary in the Cavern, you have that little bit of nodding towards the infinity, or sort of the suggestion of the vast perspective of the landscape and the vast swaths of land, right? You have the suggestion when it comes to that little alcove going off into the very, bluish aerial perspective recesses of the mountains. Almost like in that little moment, you have something that connects Leonardo to, the East in some ways. Not that I would say that, I'm just saying that the awareness of the recognition of that infinite space is there because by definition, the landscape must depict that. You must find a way to represent it, at least, to make a landscape quite open-ended. But the way he plays with perspective is quite interesting. How it is very almost claustrophobic in that cave. It's very claustrophobia mixed with that little relief hole, if you will, of the infinite. So the whole reason they've gone down the drain is precisely because they have lost significance. The discovery of visual space, together with an attendant interest in real entities, has rendered them superfluous as revelations of awe. So now it becomes realism. It becomes like depicting what is in the natural world. The Lutherans are only able to denounce them once they are no longer effective units of revelation, but now actually stand in the way of revelation via the power of the printed word. Right? So Protestant Europe, if you actually look at like Calvinist artwork, it's like, it's so alien to my Mediterranean sensibilities. But I do have a lot of affinities with northern works of art, like, Edvard Munch being one of my favorite painters of all time. The woodcut. I don't know, like, it's something that Paul Talk said about me. He's like, you paint like a northerner in a way, despite being Mediterranean. Maybe I do have some kind of Indo-European DNA lurking in the background there. So, thus Catholic St. Peter, as the patron of all images, is traded out for St. Paul, who is the author of the first church texts, becomes the unofficial Protestant saint. By the middle, that's a controversial statement, but let's go with it. By the middle of the 16th century, a new world picture is beginning to solidify. It is only then in 1543 that Copernicus dares to publish his world-demolishing treatise on astronomy. Can you imagine that? Astrology. Astronomy. Is there really a I'm not going to go down there. I'm not going to go down the whole science is fake thing, but that was a sort of Freudian slip by saying like astrology instead of astronomy, implying there's a difference. Oh boy, wow, we're really ragging on science today. One in which the world is no longer bound by a translucent macrosphere upon the walls of which iconotypes have been painted as transcendental signifieds. Infinity is now coming into being as the new grand significance that obsoletes and replaces all previous signifieds. So now it is being, it's the natural world, it's naturalism that takes over. The world dome has ruptured and spilled forth its contents. By 1600, the medieval macrosphere is gone, and a new age, Heidegger's Age of the World picture, or if you prefer Foucault's classical age, has now come into being with an entirely different set of transcendental signifieds. So, let's go into a little bit of the Age of the World picture, but then I have to cut it off, and you'll see me on the other side, so... The second age of the... So this is a subheading, the Age of the World picture. The second age of the Northern European art is composed of a world picture that is no longer saturated by religious iconotypes. They continued, of course, for a while out of sheer inertia, as in the art of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But it is unconvincing art full of Catholic kitsch and sentimentality, as in the paintings of Annabelle Carracci, or Caracce, or Zuberon, Zobran being the Spanish painter. In order to have any effect at all, the art must be overtly theatrical and manipulative, as in the case of the Bernini. The dying iconotypes are insisted upon with shouting voices that grow louder and louder in direct proportion to the lack of inspiration of the images. I guess you could say nowadays that certain forms of artworks are kind of like that as well when it comes to overt political messaging. But then again, that's never going to end, right? Like, people are like, oh my god, the end of the woke? Yeah, right, the end of the woke, I'm sure. I'm sure the art world is going to start, endorsing based right-wing artwork anytime soon now. So, but you get the point. So, in other words, you have a transformation, right? The Catholic Church during the 17th century was trying to bluster a world that had already become a ghost of itself. It is rather in the north that the new secularized iconotypes are first displayed in all their beauty and grandeur. Landscape paintings, still lifes, and portraits of the real, three-dimensional human beings. The idea of the infinite has now come in to replace all previous transcendental signifieds. The infinite horizon, the horizon lines now begin to replace the membrane of the ether sphere as the new boundary. Now it's the world picture. The world is being itself. It's representation of the real. Infinite space, the infinitesimal calculus, analytical geometry are all revelations of the new obsession with infinity that begins to come about. God himself is a transcendental signified that carries over for the medieval world order, but only on condition that has now been identified with the infinite as its primary source and ultimate vanishing point. Thus, through the Italians are, of course, as Panofsky has shown in his study of perspective and symbolic form, the first to master perspective and to identify the vanishing point with the infinite. It is the Dutch who are the great discoverers of the infinite space. The sky is featured so prominently in the art that it is quality of a new revelation of spiritual powers. So even then, you have the secularization of art. You still have the infinity of the cosmos in the background, right? And it's funny because abstract expressionism in some ways gives over to complete infinite space in its flatness. But that's a conversation that you're not ready to hear till later on. So later on in the book, I mean. But also the meme, you're not ready to hear that. So in the canvases of Van Goyen, Simon Villigar, Rusta, or Vermeer, the heavens are revealed as a source of infinite power and expansiveness that transcends any mere medieval macrosphere. The unbounded infinity of the heavens is a source of potential possibilities that is yet unfathomed. It's pure potentiality. You could say even Van Gogh had that, right, with Starry Night. That's why people are so obsessed with it. I mean, not like the low IQ, low IQ science man. What's his name? I can't believe I forget his name. He's very forgettable. DeGrasse Tyson. You remember in Joe Rogan he tried to explain like why he likes Starry Night. It's so ghastly. I don't even want to mention. I don't even want to soil this book by mentioning that. It's terrible. But anyways, this is for perhaps the first time in history a world picture that is not enclosed by boundaries or any source. There is only space now, and the human subject for the subject to is an iconotype of this age, is the primary occupant of this space. So even chiaroscuro, right, is sort of like an infinitizing of the human subject. Because now the subject is contrasted light and dark. It's in no-tan. It's extending the subject into infinite space, right? So that's my hot take on chiaroscuro. Let me read a little bit more. The creation of the transcendental subject begins with Descartes, is a constitutive feature of this age, whereas the age of perspectival space in which the world is looking at from the point of view of a single human individual. The bounded world of the medieval order is now scaled down and miniaturized to the bounded self, transcendentally sealed off by God. This transcendental ego is now apotheosized until Fichte, and its foundations the entire science of knowledge, postulates it at the end of the 18th century. A self which confronts a realm of absolute objects whose truth value is now a function of the correspondence of theory. Knowledge is really out there, ingrained in the book of nature, and for one who knows how to read it, this book of nature, it can be found and quitted. The world is an objective fact, cognizable by a subject whose vision carved out of its singular perspectival slice. So again, this is very much like the correspondence theory that comes from Descartes right away up to John Locke, that says there's superstructures in nature that the unconscious mind can perceive. Then, of course, you have the Kantian noumena that is presupposed, the sort of the faculties of the understanding, filters sensuous data, and then breaks it down, categorizes it. But the real is out there. The real is in the structure, right? But with Kant, you have a sort of like reversal to now the subject gives order and form to that. Like, this is basic Kantianism 101. But in this order of Renaissance, later Renaissance, going into Enlightenment Europe, now you have this awareness of infinite space, because now the body itself is infinitized as like resa extensa. That you have the mind, you have the body, the mind-body dualism problem. Now you have in the work of art, you have this depiction of the sensuous world as something that is attainable, something you can depict in three-dimensional space. The way that the mind can filter the sensuous world and perceive it as an actual structure of reality. Right? So these iconotypes lose meaning. And then so you have like artwork that follows this sort of lowering down of the transcendental into the earth, right? The way the Cartesian philosophy, in a lot of ways, does that. So the artist correspondingly now becomes a sort of master optician, optics, right? He is no longer the medieval cosmocrator, endlessly recreating pre-established entities and saints, but rather a master of seeing and perception. Now he's like the medieval, like the Enlightenment philosopher, right? Notice that. Notice how the trajectory of philosophy and art, the work of art, they follow each other. So, hence the use of various optical devices. Van Eyck's Affonelli marriage to Velázquez's La Manias. Spinoza, lest we forget, made his living as a lens grinder. Both artist and philosopher are precisely those which are capable of clear vision. Descartes insists that for a thing to be true, it must be clear and distinct, or in other words, brought into focus. The ontology, furthermore, is not Pentecostal, but rather evental. The world is the world is no longer a series of repetitions of sacred acts that took place once upon a time, like the way that the way that literati painting in China as well is also like a constant reinvention or rediscovering of previous forms. Now it's all about newness here in the West. So it's all about newness in Europe, but a series of singularities and unique occurrences. Every event now has its own quality and special character that must be noted down and examined by the natural sciences, the Linnaeus or the Leeuwenhoek or the Newton. The center of the art world now shifts from Italy to the Netherlands, where a whole host of clear-seeing Dutchmen are articulating the metaphysical age of the world picture. The age, in other words, which, according to Heidegger, frames the world as a picture of objectively measurable entities spread out into visually connected and continuous homogeneous space. Space now is indeed, as if for Kant, a priori. The space, before the senses. For now, space now comes first, and only then do we consider the objects that are set inside of it. This is McLuhan's Gutenbergian galaxy and Jean Gebser's perspectival phase of the mental consciousness structure. Art is now portable, painted on movable canvases, which I will talk about when it comes to landscape painting. So let's take a break. As you know, all music provided by Philip Daniel. I'll see you in the paywalled version. I'll finish up the chapter. I have a further ways to go. We're going to get into it more. But I'm going to explain to you this direct seeing of the landscape and how every event becomes a microcosm and the work of art becomes an enclosed world. So, hit it with